I don't want no oil spoiling my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes!
Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus, and hello to everyone in Bowling Green or listening on the internet, wherever or whenever you may be. My name is Joseph D. DeMare, and I'm here with my usually perambulating co-host,
Rebecca Wood, a.k.a. Ursula's massage therapist.
our dog. For the next hour, we're going to take a grand tour of the planet on our incomparable program, For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show where we talk about ecology and the environment, and we talk about them in the ways they affect you, your wealth, your health, your happiness, and the wealth and health and happiness of your friends, family, and pets. And the health and happiness of the phytoplankton in the Great Lakes, the zooplankton that eat the phytoplankton, the minnows that eat the zooplankton, the small fish like sunfish that eat the minnows, the invertebrates, like insects, crayfish, and mussels that eat whatever comes along, the big fish like largemouth bass that eat the small fish and the invertebrates, all the way up to the giant sturgeon that, interestingly, mainly eat invertebrates. Because no matter where an aquatic species lives in the water column, they, like us, are living together on this big blue ball called Earth. For the next 15 minutes or so, we're just going to have a little chat about some of our ecological observations for the week. After that, we have an interview that we here at For a Green Future have been meaning to do since we started this show way back in 2019. We have an interview with an actual organic farmer. Kristy Buskirik will be talking to us about regenerative agriculture and the gritty details about growing food without herbicides or pesticides. Organic farming actually also increases the land's fertility over time instead of traditional farming methods, which leave soil barren and infertile. After we talk with Kristy, we'll hear from our wonderful sponsors and patrons. Then it'll be time for Rebecca's weekly piece. Rebecca, what will you have for us this week?
Pigs.
Pigs.
It's football season.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
After we hear from Rebecca, we'll have ecological news from around the world. If you listened to us last week, we interviewed some of the protesters who were in New York City for the March Against Fossil Fuels. We'll look at how that march turned out and other interesting stories, including one on genetically modified caterpillars. This is a pre-recorded show. We actually taped it back on Thursday, the 21st. So you can't call in live, but please do give us your feedback. You can call or text 419-973-5841, or you can send us an email at foragreenfutureradio@gmail.com. We did get a caller this past week which tried to call us collect. We got disconnected in the process, and we wanted to tell that caller to try again. There should be less confusion this time. So now it's time for the weekly update on the Canadian wildfires. This data is as of September 13th. There's been a definite drop in the number of fires, from 633 to 603. Cooler weather has arrived. Out of control fires are also down from 257 to 226.
That's good.
A small sign of relief, yeah. There have been some rains in parts of the country. More than 250,000 people have had to evacuate, and there have been 6 confirmed deaths. More than 17.3 million hectares have burned. That's an area the size of Florida, just about 6.5 times more than a normal fire season, whatever that means these days. Many of you will be listening to this show on Saturday, September 23rd, which of course this year is fall equinox. So all of the plants and algae have been busily pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere in order to make their leaves, branches, roots, etc. We've noticed there's already some trees turning colors, although on average the first frost for the Toledo area doesn't happen until October 6th. Of course, this year has been anything but average. There's been record heat globally, there's been sea surface temperatures off the charts, and the ice caps and glaciers continue to melt at incredible rates. So who knows when the first frost will actually happen in 2023. But let's talk about the CO2 for a bit. One of the charts we like to follow as we watch the world change is the monthly mean CO2 at Mauna Loa Observatory. Wow. That's on the Big Island of Hawaii. The NOAA has been measuring carbon dioxide there for decades, and it's one of the clearest data sets we have in terms of monitoring the poisoning of our atmosphere. So during the growing season in the northern hemisphere, CO2 levels around the world actually drop. That's because we have so many forests and other plants that absorb the carbon dioxide. Right now, September through October, CO2 levels are at their lowest for the year. In other words, this is the air you're breathing right now. This is the best oxygen to CO2 ratio that you're going to get for the whole year.
Yeah, boy.
Yeah.
Guess we better enjoy it.
After October, the leaves fall and start decomposing, and CO2 levels start rising again. They'll continue rising until next May when they peak. These trends are well documented across the history of our climate monitoring systems. This is the science that climate science is about. The thing is, because the overall levels of carbon dioxide are rising, our CO2 levels right now, for the next month or so, are about where they were last November after they had begun rising again. This year's low is higher than last year's low. Unless we end fossil fuel use, this is the lowest concentration of CO2 you'll ever experience for the rest of your life.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
And for a lot of us, our lungs are not in prime condition anymore because COVID.
Right. We don't really know what the long-term health effects are of breathing higher and higher concentrations of CO2.
I'm guessing they're not good.
There's no long-term studies, but there are short-term. Right now we're breathing in CO2 at about 419 parts per million. Just 5 years ago, at this time of year, we were only at 406. The officially accepted studies say we can survive indefinitely with up to 10,000 parts per million. More than that, people start showing symptoms of CO2 poisoning. The symptoms appear more quickly and are more severe depending on the level of CO2 and the amount of exertion. Exerting yourself by working your muscles, exercising, running, you'll start to have noticeable symptoms much sooner. At 70,000 parts per million, people pass out after a few minutes. Of course, the study we're referencing was done with just 6 healthy volunteers. There are many of us who have breathing challenges that could conceivably start to feel symptoms at much lower doses. Also, athletes who exert themselves to the maximum during competitions could be affected at lower doses as well. The Apollo 13 astronauts, when their CO2 filters were failing, started experiencing blurred vision and headaches at less than 900 parts per million. The point is, we're breathing CO2 at concentrations higher than have existed at any time in human evolution. Before we started burning fossil fuels, levels were only 280 parts per million. Will there be effects of breathing almost double that concentration for decades? We can't say for sure, but common sense would suggest it can't be good. This kind of atmospheric condition, the CO2 proportions, are invisible. It can't be smelled or tasted. The only method we have of knowing the levels are rising is by looking at the data our scientific instruments are producing. Back in the early days of the environmental movement, the 1970s, Pollution was very visible. Cars regularly produced bluish clouds of hydrocarbons, and the smog was intense. Whenever a family took a long trip on the highway, you could expect some of the passengers to get car sick, in part from the exhaust fumes they were breathing in from the trucks and cars around them. One of the greatest accomplishments of the environmental movement so far was to clean up the automobile exhaust. There are strict regulations that mandate automakers to reduce the amount of noxious gases their cars generate. That's the function of the catalytic converters on our cars, to finish the combustion of toxic gasoline. Today, car exhaust is almost only CO2 and water. And of course, non-internal combustion engine cars have almost no emissions to speak of. Maybe if we could see the CO2 being produced, we'd be more inclined to eliminate it. That's what led to our current reforms. It's just human nature. But
I remember when I was a kid, I used to get car sick because new car smell made me sick. But everyone would be like, oh, it's just in your head, you're just imagining it. And then, the news came out about off-gassing and how bad that was.
Yeah, so many little chemicals mixed in with your car. Even though it's invisible, these fumes, the CO2 especially, is still there and still dangerous. We've got to start thinking on a higher level and realize that just because car exhaust doesn't look dirty, that doesn't mean it really is clean. It was easier for everyone to agree that getting rid of the pollution was a good thing back when families had to carry something for their car-sick kids to throw up in.
Yep.
Now that we're fighting an invisible foe, it's much harder to get everyone on board. An obnoxious minority completely deny the need to change it all. But we must make these changes, and this is the year to do it. We've reported before about the tax credits and other incentives for getting electric cars or switching to heat pumps and away from gas furnaces. This year, you can receive subsidies for up to 1/3 the cost.
Cool.
Of course, the problem with this kind of incentive is that suppliers may simply raise their prices.
Yep.
We saw this in California back when the state subsidized half of the cost of putting in household wind turbine or solar panels. Overnight, the suppliers doubled their prices. We're actually currently pricing a ground source geothermal system for our home. According to the representative who's working on the estimate, demand for geothermal is definitely increasing. That's good news. But it looks like prices may be increasing at a much greater pace.
Maybe.
Heating and cooling companies that have operated for only a century using natural gas aren't motivated about changing all their installations over to 100% electric heat pumps. But that's what has to happen. Right now, the people switching to heat pumps are largely motivated by their own desire to save the planet and to have a cleaner household. Retailers often take advantage of such motivated buyers to charge higher prices and to make more profits. But that has to change. We have to get to the point where heat pumps are the norm, not the exception. And the installers have to compete on prices. It's not impossible. It's already happening in Europe. We need to change the way we think about our heating and cooling systems without having Russia blackmail us over our gas supplies.
You're here.
As the numbers on the CO2 graph climb higher and higher, they're approaching a point where our society will simply collapse. As the climate becomes less and less hospitable, maintaining the infrastructure that supplies us with gas and electricity becomes more and more difficult. The exact number beyond which rising CO2 levels cause our society collapse can't be known until we cross it. Let's try not to do that. Another way we can reduce our CO2 levels is by changing our agricultural methods. Organic farming, by way of building up organic matter in the soil, actually sequesters carbon. Our traditional energy-intensive farming methods use many times the amount of fossil fuels to run farming equipment, and the soil on such farms has less and less carbon sequestered over time. We started the 20th century with topsoil that was about 12 inches thick. That soil was rich in sequestered carbon. But now most of that topsoil has literally evaporated into the air, increasing carbon levels even more. Organic farmers actively work to prevent that loss of soil fertility. They use techniques like mulching and composting to put the carbon back into the soil where it belongs. There's also a host of other benefits, such as the taste. You could do a blind taste test with an organic carrot versus an agribusiness carrot, and you wouldn't have any trouble telling them apart. So we're very excited to bring you our interview with Kristy Buskirik, organic farmer extraordinaire. Just like us, her motivation is to do what she can to save the world. Let's go to
Welcome to For a Green Future. Could you give us a little background about you and your farm?
Hi, my name's Kristy Buskirik. I am in my 9th year of running my own farm. We have been certified organic since our 2nd season because it takes 3 years to transition, or 36 months. So yeah, we've been organic for 8 of those 9 seasons, technically. We live on a family farm, so I married into a farm family. We farm some of that land that has been in the family for a while that was conventionally farmed with green crops, and we have converted it into an organic produce farm.
So what kind of produce do you grow?
We grow a little bit of everything here. We are a cut flower and produce farm. So at some point we kind of questioned whether cut flowers needed to be organic, but when you run an organic farm, it is an entire ecological system. There is no real way to have one part of that you treat differently than the other one because of proper crop rotation. So all the cut flowers are also organic. And then produce, really, we grow, like I said, a little bit of everything. Some stuff that's very traditional here, like sweet corn, we don't grow a ton of. It takes a lot of space, and we are a bit of a smaller farm. So there are some conventional things that we do not grow. But yeah, we grow broccoli, tons of greens, kohlrabi, then all the tomatoes, peppers, garlic, onions, potatoes, winter squash, summer squash.
All the classics.
Yeah. Yes, all the classics.
So you said you started in non-organic farming. What made you switch to organic farming specifically?
Well, the farm that we inherited was not organic because it was being farmed conventionally as a grain farm. So we did decide to transfer that. I have always worked for organic farms, actually. When I started apprenticing, or when I got interested, my husband and I started off wolfing. And I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's called Willing Workers on Organic Farms. I actually don't know how active that is anymore. I think it started in Europe, and it was a very English thing. And farms would host workers who'd come and typically either live with you or on the farm. They would provide you with meals. And it was a great way to sort of dip your toe into this world, right? You get people who maybe just wanted to travel a little differently, but my husband and I were very interested in this type of living. We did some wolfing on some farms in the United States, and we also did some wolfing on some farms down in South America. But always with the idea that it was going to be organic or not using any chemicals, because that's just how we've always been oriented towards our relationship with the earth, and not wanting to kill any of the creatures on it with sprays and stuff. So just kind of always understanding that was the methodology that we wanted to learn.
Wow, that's really interesting. So it's like a little bit of a co-op situation where there's a group of workers that basically get paid in food. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, it's like a true work trade, where you go and get skills essentially, and have, an experience. And they're all different. Like the ones in, we did one in Ecuador and one in Mexico. That was a lot of just like living there and sort of experiencing the culture. And we did some natural building at a lot of those. And then some here that we did was a little more organized. I mean, not really. And then we did some building projects. So yeah, it's like gaining skills, living in community. And then, yes, they do not pay you, but you get fed, right? And housing.
So it sounds like you've been in the business for a long time, transitioning to a larger scale of farm. You're managing it now. Did you realize how much work that would be when you started the process?
Yeah, yes and no. I would say that probably any business owner may not realize what they're getting into when they start a business. I was very interested in farming. I've always been interested in flowers. I had some landscaping jobs. But the difference when you own a business is then I have to run the business, but the farming aspect is very demanding. I work pretty hard on the farm. We do a lot of stuff by hand still. We are pretty mechanized at this point. But one of the most common things I am told by any of my neighbors that I run across is, boy, you guys work really hard. So yes, I guess I kind of knew, but I think the other layer, not just the organic aspect, but just the running a business, which also has a lot of demands on you because of
Right.
accounting and managing employees. So it's many tiered, the work.
So many farmers believe that it's not possible to get substantial yields without using fertilizers and pesticides. What's been your experience since you're in your whole life that you've been involved in these kinds of projects?
Yeah, so I've kind of thought a lot about this and had a lot of conversations with people about this. I do not think you can get the same yields that farmers who use stuff here are used to getting consistently, because when you plant super seeds into the ground that have been
Right.
designed to grow, sometimes with very limited water, fertility, and marginal soils, there's a lot of fields here that can produce something marketable without many with plenty of inputs, but not without the type of work I have to do for vegetables. Now, vegetables and grains are very different. Um, so I think, though, that that argument has a lot of fallacy to it, because a lot of food grown in the United States is fed to animals. It is exported. There is a ton of waste. I think that our culture on a whole wastes a lot of food. So this idea that we can't produce enough food this way has a lot of fallacy to it. Can I grow grain crops the same way and get yields off of the marginal land a lot of people farm? No. Should you be farming produce on that land? Not necessarily. Is there enough really good land that we could grow produce to feed everybody? Yes. So, yeah, I do not get the same amount of money out of my land, but I get a lot more out of parts of my land. But can I farm all of my land? No, some of it just needs to be rested because it is not produce land. Um, so yeah, these arguments that people have about organics and the problems with it, I think is a little bit of limited thinking. They're thinking about the systems that we're used to seeing. And if you literally took that exact system and turned it over to organic, would you get the same results? No, probably not. But there's like a lot of other things that would need to change. Um,
Do you think all farms should transition towards an organic method of, method of farming?
I would like to live in a society that valued human health and animal health and water health. So yes. Could that happen quickly? Probably not. The agriculture system is very complicated, and I haven't been paying attention super close, but even when you hear stuff about the war in Ukraine and stuff happening with grain there, and then the world economy around grain and how a lot of our society eats and how at this point, how interconnected that is, I think there's a lot to understand, but we are absolutely shooting ourselves in the foot, and we have been for a very long time. Our health is suffering. The planet's health is suffering. Our water health is suffering. So do we need to address this? Absolutely. I would never feel comfortable asking my employees to work in a place where I was spraying things where they, had to be suited up in gear. Like, I did get my pesticide applicator's license when I worked for the Park Service. We did spray herbicides on some super noxious invasive species. I was kind of comfortable with it in that context because we were trying to save habitat for endangered species. But I did have to wear like a full gear, and there's some labels that say you cannot eat food if it's been sprayed within a certain amount of days
Right.
with a crop. Like, there is no, in organics, we do use sprays. I use sprays, I have to, on certain insects. A lot of them are more biological in nature, like it attacks the digestive system of a worm. Does that affect me? No. Would I drink it? No. But the harvest interval, there's a couple terms that you use, is like 0. Like, you can spray this stuff and harvest it. So I feel very comfortable with that. I would not feel comfortable spraying the other stuff. So yes, it'd
Or
be nice.
it would be nice. For those farmers considering switching to organic practices, how difficult is it to be certified organic, and how long does that process take? I think you said a few years.
Certified organic. So it is a federal program and it is overseen by, smaller institutions. Our certifier is called the Ohio Ecological Food and Farming Association. They're in Columbus. I think they do quite a few states around here, but they're the big certifier. They have an educational wing and then they have the certifying wing. They operate kind of together, but they are a little bit separate. They do a lot of call it hand holding. They offer seminars on transferring into organics, the best ways to do it. They want you to be certified organic. They want you to be successful. So I've only learned, I've only learned how to do farming organically. So a lot of this stuff really was second nature. There's some nuance, like you have to learn all about what you can and cannot do. You have to do a lot of record keeping, but most business owners should be doing a lot of record keeping about what you buy and what you harvest and how much money you're making off of that and your yields and stuff. So that is another argument that I find a bit laughable when people say it's too hard or too expensive. That just sounds like an excuse to me. It is about $1,000 right now to get certified. I have to get certified every year. It is, like most government stuff, a big, long packet. They are trying to reduce that. If there's things on your farm that don't change, you don't have to go over those. You just have to update parts that do change. And so it's a bit of paperwork, it's record keeping, and then you do have an inspection. But that $1,000 fee built into the farm bill every year is a $700 repayment. So you do have to pay up front, but the government does give you some money back for, just incentivizing or, thanking you or whatever for that. So yes, you have to pay for it, but it's not, I don't think $300 for an organic certification is a large sum to pay at all. I have to pay a lot of money for a lot of things. That is not one of the bigger bills. And as I mentioned earlier, it does take 36 months to transition land if it's had what they call a prohibitive substance on that land. You do have to wait 36 months before you can call that, before you're harvesting something off of that you can call organic. So within that 36 months, if I planted a crop, say at 30 months, but then I'm harvesting it at that 36, technically you can call that organic. There's kind of technicalities about it. And then in the meantime, you could call it transitional. Most customers are not that specific about my farming practices, but at this point I'm established enough in the community that I think they trust me and don't question my methods at this point.
For those considering switching, would it be more practical, do you think, to start with a few fields and see what the process is, or would it be more advisable to try to switch a whole farm over to organic?
It depends on your scale. Like if you're a grain farmer and you have like a 50-acre field, that is a huge risk. So that should be done. And let's just stick with the grain example. So grain farming organically and non-organically are pretty different and require very different tools. So it would be a significant investment by a farmer to get certain cultivators or say a flame weeder or something that would do a scale that big. So they probably should start small, or maybe if they had a neighbor and they could share equipment, or if there's some way they could rent equipment, but that is a pretty big leap. Like there is a lot of risk in that scale of farming if you don't come through, which is why they lean heavily on the chemicals and stuff, because if you cannot get a yield off of that big of an investment of time and space, like that is a huge loss. In terms of a produce farmer or something, yeah, I mean, we have some things that we do. Like I plant more than I ever think I'm going to need because I know there's going to be some loss. Like there are some methods that I do, in some years, if you plant 20 crops, maybe 5 of them don't come through actually, because we had a very mild winter. We had a lot of fungal diseases blow in on the winds really early because we didn't have a heavy frost anywhere, in the country. So there's things that you can't control that are going to happen every year. And a bit of the beauty of having a small diversified farm is I have a lot of resiliency built into that. So if I have these 20 crops I'm growing and only say 10 of them come through, I still have 10 crops. If you have a grain field and have a bad year and something doesn't come through, that's a pretty big loss of like a single crop. So I think going small scale probably would be the best step to figure some stuff out and get some of your mechanization in line. Because it can be pretty hard to make that switch. They are pretty different methodologies.
Have you heard of agrivoltaics? That's the process of planting your crops under a field of solar panels. What do you think about that idea for your farm or in general?
I have heard of it, but I do not know many details. I think solar panels are great. I think utilizing
Us
space,
too.
yes. Um, I think utilizing space between them could be really cool. I think I don't know, is there something about sun refracting that helps the stuff grow better? Is that part of it or
There's
no? Is there?
there's a few studies, but there isn't enough evidence to definitively say one way or the other.
Well, actually, we could just leave this part out if you're not familiar enough with it to talk about it comfortably. But just
Okay.
to answer your question, the agrivoltaic panels are put like in a checkerboard pattern so that some light is reduced. No, don't turn the camera to me.
We're cutting what you're saying out anyway.
Yeah, I know, but all right. Yeah, so basically the idea is that the crops get partial shade, and so some of the crops that don't do well in full sun actually can substantially increase yield. And there have been studies done on that, but we could just skip the whole agrivoltaics question and go on to the next.
Okay. I mean, that does sound very cool. Whenever you can take spaces that may or not be utilized and make them into something productive, that's surely a win-win.
Okay, well, maybe we'll leave that in.
Okay.
Okay, let's go. Let's keep going.
Well, thanks so much for being on our show here. How can people learn more about your farm and get some of your produce?
My farm's name is Clay Hill. Lots of times it's written as Clay Hill Produce and Flowers. That is our email address. So clayhillproduceandflowers@gmail. We do not have a website, but I am on Instagram and we are at Clay Hill Organic. And again, my name is Kristy Buskirik. It's my husband, Aaron, and I that own this, and we sell mostly direct to consumer. We are at the Toledo Farmers Market on Saturday mornings. We are at the Bowling Green Farmers Market on Wednesday evenings, and I am also at the Tiffin Farmers Market on Saturday mornings.
Is there anything final you'd like to add for our listeners?
Support local, buy organic food, or grow your own food.
All right. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to that interview. Now let's hear from our patrons and sponsors.
For a Green Future is also brought to you by the Wood County Park District. The Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They also restore wildlife habitats and lead people on outdoor adventures. Wood County Parks protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. There are several ways to get a hold of them and find out what's happening. One is to call them at 419-353-1897. Another is to visit their website, www.wcparks.org. The website again is www.wcparks.org. They are also available on all social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and many others. Just search for WC Parks. That's the Wood County Park District, and we're very grateful for their support.
All right, Rebecca, it's time to talk about pigs.
Okay, I just want to point out real quickly before we start that today is actually on the date of the filming this is the birthday of my late assistant canine co-host Koga. But today mostly I wanted to talk about football. Football season has just started. I have been made aware of this because on Monday I walked into my living room and there was some unpleasant noise which I was not allowed to turn off because it was a big game between the Browns and the Steelers, and it's if we turned it off, something terrible might happen. So I want to talk about football a little bit.
This is an ESPN channel.
There we go. Yeah, totally. In honor of our lovely and gracious colleagues back over at the sports station. Apparently, the conventional wisdom as it came out, it's related to rugby, it's sort of distantly related from soccer. It might be kind of like all of those games actually came from something called European mob football that used to happen probably around fall when some hogs were being butchered and people used to like to kick around pigs' bladders. And they would have a thing where like entire villages, the population of this village versus that village would all try and steal the pig bladder because it was the Middle Ages. There was not that much fun to be had. So the only real rule was that no actual manslaughter was allowed.
Pig slaughter, I guess, was okay.
Yeah, to be fair, okay, I would like to point out that these days, most footballs are not actually made out of pig bladder or any part of a pig anymore, and they guess they probably never were killing the pig just for that purpose. It was for food purposes mostly. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about a little bit about the domestic pig, which is in the genus Sus, and is an omnivorous domesticated even-toed ungulate artiodactyl. The subspecies is Sus scrofa. This is the thing, it's kind of like the thing with deal with dogs and wolves. Nobody can really, there's arguments about whether it is a subspecies of wild Eurasian boar or a separate species, it's a matter of opinion apparently.
Common ancestors, somewhere back then.
There we go, yeah, not that far, so it's still kind of controversial. But yeah, the heaviest can be over 770 pounds. They're kind of weird for artiodactyls, which are even-toed ungulates, meaning they've got an even number of toes, and in most of them, like the center two toes take most of the weight, unless you're on some kind of soft ground or something and they're sinking in. But yeah, they have a long head for an artiodactyl, and most artiodactyls are herbivores. So pigs are omnivores, so they're a little unusual that way. Also called Sus domestica or Sus scrofa domesticus, depending on whether you're looking at it like a separate species or not. They also have a cartilage disc at the tip of their nose that reinforces their snout because it has to be strong because they dig up food with that. Food, real important. The male tusks are actually overgrown canine teeth. Each coop encompasses 4 toes. And they're descended from the Eurasian wild pig, which is native to Eurasia and Africa and introduced into the Americas and Oceania. And it has one of the widest ranging mammals. It's one of the widest ranging mammals in the entire world. And it's the most widespread suiform. A suiform, I discovered, is a suborder of omnivorous non-ruminant artiodactyls. So,
of course.
Yeah, that's what that is. It includes domestic pigs and peccaries. Peccaries being New World pigs, apparently. And since we're an environmentalist show, pig farming in mass, industrial scale, really not good. Creates feces and waste. Dumps pathogens into the air and the water, including antibiotic-resistant bacteria and heavy metals. A couple of things happen. The waste goes into lagoons, which seeps into the groundwater, or they spray the waste around and some of it gets on the neighbors because they're spraying it back by sprinklers to try and recycle it, which is not as good an idea as it thinks it is. Also, little tidbit, Australia has the largest pork industry in the world, or at least one of them apparently. So That's pigs for you. Also, interestingly, there's at least one book I read that basically said that it was kind of the luck of the draw that we ended up eating pigs and keeping dogs as pets. Could have been the other way around. True dogs are a little fuzzier, but that's because we bred them that way, you know. But yeah, pigs actually make pretty good pets, and dogs taste okay, apparently. Although I'm very North European, I get very upset about the idea of people eating dogs. But objectively speaking, it's not really any more upsetting than pigs are intelligent, affectionate animals and stuff too. So
Yeah, it's a society thing.
we just kind of decided that dogs were precious BBs.
All right. Thanks,
Okay.
Rebecca.
You're welcome.
Now it's time for our section on ecological news. Our first story sees a return to New York City, where last Sunday, September 17th, the March to End Fossil Fuels held their annual protest. We were lucky enough to have some impassioned activists as our guests last week, and we can happily report they were just a few of the 75,000 people who attended. Over 1,200 groups made it to the protest, each driven by the existential threat of global warming and the human-made catastrophes we all are facing today. Worldwide, over 600,000 people protested in 65 countries. However, their efforts, and your own, can't just stop because the march is over. They continue to call on President Biden to unequivocally end fossil fuel usage in the United States before it's too late. You can find more information about their struggle at peoplevsfossilfuels.org. The date of the march last weekend was chosen specifically for being before the United Nations Climate Ambition Summit on September 20th. That was a one-day summary of the intentions of the United Nations to progress more energy-efficient practices and to commit to better climate practices worldwide. Their meeting was intended to represent a demonstration of collective global will to transition into a healthier global economy. And from our initial impressions, it did just that. The Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, in his opening remarks, opened with a fiery speech saying that humanity has opened the gates of hell and excoriating the major emitting nations for not doing more. But the intentions of certain United Nations leaders that see the necessity of society-wide changes unfortunately does not directly translate into better practices for individual countries. That pressure can only come from the intentions and outrage from the ground up. That's from the citizens living there. This first summit meeting is just the first of a few smaller meetings that will all take place before the 2023 United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP28, set to begin on the 30th of November and continuing for 2 full weeks. However, many in the environmental community are outraged that COP28 will take place in the United Arab Emirates, one of the world's leading fossil fuel producers. They fear that there will be a repeat of last year's COP meeting held in Saudi Arabia that saw all the environmental organizations sequestered miles away from the venue, all while the representatives of giant oil corporations had full, unfettered access. But there's always hope. During this COP in early December, we'll also get to hear the first ever global stocktake. That's the evaluation of how the Paris Agreement has affected energy policies and climate goals since its inception. You can bet that we'll be reporting on that and anything else interesting that comes out of the conference. Every chance we'll get. Next up, we have a reminder for anyone wishing to make their comments known on the recently released Yellowstone Bison Management Plan. We last reported on this a few weeks ago on September 3rd and interviewed Stephanie C. from Roam Free Nation. In brief summary, in our opinion, each of the currently proposed plans is too restrictive on the buffalo population and too lenient on what happens to the herds right outside the national park's boundaries. These animals are being trapped or slaughtered with the implicit approval of Yellowstone because of their artificially imposed herd size guidelines. There used to be millions of bison found across North America, even farther east than Ohio, and it is solely the efforts of humans that has led to their near-threatened status today. These are the last few days that public comments will be accepted, ending on September 5th. So, if you're like us and...
That's September 25th.
Ending on September 25th. So, if you're like us and want to see a return of the American bison to a larger extant population, you can go to roamfreenation.org to find out more information and to find the links to comment on Yellowstone's plans. Our next story is part of a series of reports from the U.S. Department of Energy. Back in March 2023, the Department of Energy committed to assist the private sector and other industry partners with the knowledge and resources of how sustainable practices are achievable at a large scale. This has been called the Lift-Off series, and they've already published studies and analyses on such topics as clean hydrogen, long-duration energy storage, and carbon management. Unfortunately, since the language of these reports is intended to appeal to company executives and boardrooms, much of the framing is focused on profits or cost saving. But the purpose is clear and honorable. These are all intended to advance clean electricity and a net zero emissions economy. The latest of this Lift-Off series has just been released, with 3 separate reports focusing on industrial decarbonization. This goes into great detail on how the emissions from certain areas of industry could be dramatically reduced. The first report deals in broad strokes with many different areas of industry. However, the second focuses specifically on chemical production and refining facilities. In order to reach a net zero emissions standard, dramatic changes have to be made. These two fields combined cause 38% of the total energy-related industrial emissions in the United States. So what is their net zero pathway? Firstly, we're talking about a long period of time. The timeline Biden has presented has the first deadline set at 2030, and each of these liftoff reports have projections through 2050. So the first suggested step is purely practical. Start laying the groundwork to be more efficient. This means transitioning all energy sources in all factories into cleaner power. It means starting to create hydrogen in-house through the use of electrolysis, rather than having hydrogen be shipped in from elsewhere. And it means moving away from industrial processes that incidentally create emissions, like natural gas for heating, and towards all electrical solutions. If the chemical production and refining industries follow every avenue currently feasible to them, their emissions could drop by as much as 25% by the first deadline of 2030. That's pretty good. These kinds of processes will always have a large amount of pollution, but to achieve the fabled net zero emissions, we'll have to go far beyond that, and that's the unfortunate part. Without a breakthrough technology in emission reduction or the industrial production process, a large part of the plan of achieving net zero is through carbon capture and storage, or CCS. This describes the process of separating CO2 from the other gases produced through industry, compressing it and shipping it, usually through pipelines, to injection facilities to be stored deep underground. Without even getting into the unreliability and catastrophic construction methods of commercial pipelines, CCS relies entirely on the assumption that long-term storage of carbon deep underground is even possible. On the surface of it, it seems ludicrous that we're pinning all our hopes on this ultimately unproven technology. It's like if a kid buried a toy he broke in his backyard. Eventually, it'll show up back again, and it'll still be just as broken. When we send carbon dioxide, the gas, down into the earth, it will come back up eventually. And when the scale of time we're talking about is the lifetime of the Earth, relatively speaking, that'll be sooner rather than later. It's kind of a similar story to our problem with nuclear energy and the waste it produces. This kind of stick your head in the sand solution just doesn't cut it, and we need a better one. At the very least, though, we can give this plan some credit. It is a pathway to net zero emissions in the short to medium term, and following it would give us a lot more time to figure out permanent solutions. The third Liftoff series report on industrial decarbonization deals specifically with cement production. Cement is a surprisingly high percentage of global CO2 emissions, about 7.5%, and is very important to consider for achieving our countrywide emissions goals. However, 85% of cement emissions comes directly from the calcination process or through high-temperature heat sources. Currently, neither of those sources of emissions have a technical solution. The good news is, as per the report, there are novel cement replacements due to be demonstrated at a commercial scale in the next decade. That means we could see a reshaping of the entire industry at any time. And if the government is committed enough to entirely transition to one of these cement substitutes, that would account for a full 50% of the cement demand of the United States, moving towards a cleaner solution. As a nation of capitalistic opportunists, the United States could be on the brink of a global cement revolution. Another Liftoff series report that was released this week discussed virtual power plants, which is a very interesting byproduct of the increase in electric vehicle sales and privately owned battery-stored renewable energies. A virtual power plant refers to the theoretical ability of the electrical grid to draw power from many individual small-scale power sources to meet demand, especially to take the load off peak hours of consumption. For example, a neighborhood where each household had a backup solar battery system or an electric vehicle could be considered in terms of the aggregate reserve power supply of all of those sources combined, and that energy might be utilized during the middle of the day as opposed to just buying the energy from a coal power plant. In other words, it's a way to use the excess power that each individual might be generating throughout the day. Of course, this would be an opt-in system, or maybe new construction would be built with this capability in mind. And, so says the report, you would be compensated in some way for the use of your energy. Currently, the maximum VPP capability of the United States is somewhere between 30 and 60 gigawatts, or 4 to 8% of the total. Ideally, as the report says, this capacity should be tripled by 2030. It's all a very cool and very natural application of our stored energy, and I hope this kind of technology will be something to watch out for in the future. For our next story, we travel to Ontario. We have reported before about the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford. He leads something called the Progressive Conservative Party, which in fact is just purely conservative. Often compared to Donald Trump, Ford has declared war on the environment. As one of his first acts was when he was elected back in 2018, he wasted $231 million taxpayer dollars tearing down wind turbines. Many of them were already hooked to the grid, brand new and fully functional. He has since gone on to attack all things green, and this past year announced that he was going to create a revival of Canada's nuclear power industry. By quadrupling the amount wasted tearing down wind turbines, he has committed $1 billion to expanding the Bruce nuclear power plant. He's apparently hoping that people have forgotten the last nuclear plant Canada built bankrupted the public utility Ontario Hydro. But, as we here in Ohio have learned from House Bill 6, where billions of dollars are being poured into nuclear power, corruption is not far behind. For the past several months, reporters from the Toronto Star and the Narwhal have been reporting on a massive corruption scandal that has actually shaken the seemingly politically invincible Doug Ford. Ford was first elected in 2018 and then re-elected in 2022 with huge margins, But apparently that victory had made him so arrogant that he has now made a tremendous blunder. Back in 2005, Ontario protected 2 million acres, creating a green belt that included farmland, wetlands, streams, and forests. It was the largest green belt in the world. Adjacent to Toronto, it included the Niagara Escarpment and the Oak Ridges Moraine. Well, good old Doug Ford decided to carve up the Greenbelt and give it to his personal political supporters that happened to be real estate developers. By giving the public land to his cronies for next to nothing and allowing them to develop those forests, wetlands, and farmlands with little or no regulation, he was enriching his friends by an estimated $8.5 billion. When the Toronto Star and Narwhal news outlets broke this story, Ontario's Auditor General and Integrity Commissioner started to investigate. They released reports saying that Doug Ford had clear conflicts of interest and had violated Canada's Code of Ethics. Good on them. Faced with increasingly serious investigations that kept uncovering his apparent violations of ethics and possibly of laws, Ford's ministers began resigning en masse. On September 21st, Ford announced he was reversing his actions. He announced he was taking back all the land he had given away, and he apologized for planning to destroy the Greenbelt. This move may have been triggered by reports that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were beginning an investigation of their own, or maybe he got some advice from the architect of House Bill 6, Ohio's jailed nuclear power booster Larry Householder, who's now serving a 20-year prison term. Ontarians have, up until now, embraced Doug Ford's obnoxious public persona and his anti-environmental policies, but apparently just stealing public lands and giving them to personal friends may have been a step too far. For now, environmentalists can celebrate the successful defense of the natural areas that had been scheduled for bulldozing. Our next story takes us back to Yellowstone for a quick report from the Center for Biological Diversity. Conservation groups filed a lawsuit today challenging the U.S. Forest Service's approval of a large timber sale just outside Yellowstone National Park that would destroy important habitat for embattled species. Christine Ackland, Northern Rockies director and senior attorney at the Center for Biological Diversity, said, quote, "This clear-cutting project is a direct threat to grizzly bears, lynx, and the entire Yellowstone ecosystem," end quote. The South Plateau project proposes to clear-cut more than 5,500 acres of pine forest on the Custer-Gallatin National Forest. The project also calls for logging on an additional 9,000 acres and bulldozing up to 56 miles of roads, many through mature forests. The agency approved this South Plateau project without identifying the locations, timing, or scope of the logging units or roads. The Biden administration continues to promise to protect and safeguard our forests, while still approving of huge clear-cuts like this one. For our final story, we have genetically modified caterpillars. Silkworms, in fact, being the caterpillar stage of the Bombyx mori. Paul Motster from Nature World News reports on this, as first published on September 20th in the journal Matter. Scientists based in China have successfully synthesized spider silk from their chimeric larvae. Now you might be thinking, this is old news, that's been around for years. You'd be partially correct. This has been a theory for a very long time, and silkworms were first induced to create spider silk proteins by a Californian laboratory back around the start of 2012. But each of those previous attempts in 2012, 2015, 2018, etc., they were all missing the surface layer of glycoproteins and lipids that a web created by a real spider would have. This is the first synthesis of complete, full-length spider silk strands from genetically modified silkworms. Spider silk, of course, is incredibly strong, 6 times as tough as Kevlar, and significantly better in all relevant areas than the regular silk from these silkworms. And now, perhaps the kind of commercial fiber revolution that was discussed all the way back in 2012 might actually happen. The long-standing ambition to render artificial fibers obsolete may well be fulfilled. since the cultivation and rearing of silkworms for their thread is already a very profitable process. All that's required for large-scale commercialization is an easier application of the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing process the researchers used. Whatever the case, we'll look forward to this and other technological breakthroughs inspired by the natural world. We've already seen so many innovations inspired by the animal kingdom, and hopefully we can continue advancing our society by giving due respect to the other residents of the world. Well, that'll be it for our show this week. Again, you can reach out to us with comments or questions to 419-973-5841 or by email at foragreenfutureradio@gmail.com. We'll be back next week with even more ecological news.
I don't want no oil spoiling my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes!